This reading comes from the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. In this passage, she describes how her friend Wally Bear Meshigo, who was a ceremonial firekeeper for the Potawatomi people, must go to special efforts when he goes to a fair or powwow to procure sweetgrass for ceremonial purposes. She writes, he introduces himself to the seller, explains his need just as he would in a meadow asking permission of the sweetgrass. He cannot pay for it, not because he doesn't have the money, but because it cannot be bought or sold and still retain its essence for ceremony. He expects sellers to graciously give him what he needs, but sometimes they don't. The guy at the booth thinks he's being shaken down by an elder. Hey, you can't get something for nothing, he says. But that is exactly the point. A gift is something for nothing, except that certain obligations are attached. For the plant to be sacred, it cannot be sold. Reluctant entrepreneurs will get a teaching from Wally, but they'll never get his money. Sweetgrass belongs to Mother Earth. Sweetgrass pickers collect properly and respectfully for their own use and the needs of their community. They return a gift to the earth and tend to the well-being of the wingashk, or sweetgrass. The braids are given as gifts to honor, to say thank you, to heal, and to strengthen. The sweetgrass is kept in motion. When Wally gives sweetgrass to the fire, it is a gift that is passed from hand to hand, growing richer as it is honored in every exchange. And that is the fundamental nature of gifts. They move, and their value increases with their passage. That reading from Braiding Sweetgrass reminds us of a deep relationship with nature and its gifts, one that is rooted in reciprocity. In the southern Peruvian Andes, in a region known as the Sacred Valley of the Incas, there is an extraordinary agricultural landscape high up in the mountains that spans 6 villages at different altitudes, all the way up to 15,000 feet above sea level. I've been fortunate to visit it on several occasions, and the first time was almost 20 years ago. And I've returned since several times with various colleagues and with my family, most recently last December. The indigenous Quechua occupants, descendants of the Inca, are the true guardians of this landscape, continuing their ancestral practices of farming, tubers, beans, grains, and livestock, but especially the potato, which is a staple of their diet. 2 decades ago, aware of the threats to their traditional farming practices, these Quechua communities decided to join together in managing their ancestral territory, and they created El Parque de la Papa, or the Potato Park. There are some 1,350 varieties of potato found there. This kind of genetic diversity within the single crop species of potato, also called agrobiodiversity, is in this case the product of a long and intricate relationship between these people and their landscape. The concentration of such diversity in El Parque de la Papa makes it a global treasure of agricultural heritage, and it has been recognized as such by international institutions, such as the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Well, there is much that could be said about what these intricate, sophisticated ancestral farming systems have to teach us all about resilience, and all the more so now as the mountain-dwelling communities of the Andean region adapt to climate change, like communities worldwide. But what I want to mention here is the place that all these different kinds of potatoes have in the social and cultural life of these communities. How basic they are to what the Quechua calls sumac kusai, or in Spanish, buen vivir, in other words, good life. There is a wide variety of potatoes used in daily meals, and there are others with very special roles. There's, for example, the chuño, a kind of freeze-dried potato that keeps forever and is incredibly filling, good for periods between harvest. There is the potato that makes the daughter-in-law cry because its knobby spiral shape makes it so hard to peel. And there are certain kinds of potatoes that are considered sacred. I was fascinated to learn on my first visit that these sacred potatoes are not to be cut with a knife nor pierced by a fork, but rather eaten by hand. This year, the pandemic has strained local economies and food security in places all over the world, and Peru is no exception. Early in the pandemic, Peru initiated a strict lockdown. Many urban dwellers living in poverty suddenly had no way to make a living in the informal economy, no way to eat. You may have seen the images from this past spring, people walking across that country, abandoning the cities to return to their home communities in the countryside where they might have a better chance of finding food. Families leaving the sprawling conurbation of Lima on the coast and walking hundreds of miles up into the mountains. High in the Andes, many residents of the city of Cusco were similarly affected by problems of economic losses and hunger. And so one day in May, the association of the communities I mentioned, the potato park communities, traveled the 30 or so miles to that city with a portion of their harvest. They brought 1 ton of potatoes to share with vulnerable populations in that city, many of them indigenous brothers and sisters who had left rural villages to settle there. Now, this may seem like an extraordinary act of charity, but that concept does not really exist in the same way that we think of it here. Rather, as one of the local leaders from the potato park communities explained, the potatoes that we bring today to our brothers and sisters who lack food in Cusco are a demonstration of Aini, the Andean principle of solidarity and reciprocity, which we have practiced since Incan times. Since learning this story from our colleague and friend Alejandro, who has worked with these communities for decades, I have pondered that communal act of generosity. I have tried to imagine what that gift of potatoes looked like, a jumble of tubers of different kinds, shapes, and sizes. Some of them brightly colored, every one of them sacred.
It's so good to be here. And we're learning as we do this. One thing I've learned today is that I do better when my feet are on the ground. So I'm on this chair and I find myself keep wanting to stand and be with you all. But it's good to be here. So it's very interesting. As a minister, there are actually few things that garner a greater response than the topic of food. That might sound odd and it might surprise you, but it's true. I can write about or preach about authenticity, any kinds of theology, morality, justice, and people respond. Some people respond. However, let me throw in the topic of food, and people respond by the bushel. I'll give just a couple examples. When I was doing my internship in New London, Connecticut, the question came up, I raised the question of whether or not we should be having sugary food items at coffee hour. And we had this church-wide listserv, this email, and I put it into that where I was put in this question. There was so many responses and opinions and thoughts about this that my supervisor actually pulled me into her office one day and said, "What have you done?" And it never did get resolved. I believe there were hundreds of responses to the question, should we allow there to be sugary items at coffee hour? Most recently, I put a post on Facebook that showed off the organization of my spice drawer, actually right behind me, underneath of the overhang. And I took a photograph of it and thought, oh, this is kind of silly. Should I really put this up on Facebook? But I had organized it one day during COVID, and it elicited so many comments, many of them hilarious. I think one of my favorites was Jennifer Raybould, who said that her husband organized her spices by the store where they were bought. It's very fun. So when I preach about being an alcoholic in recovery, I also always mention that I am allergic to sugar. It is typically one line out of what is often a 20-minute sermon. And yet, inevitably, and I have offered that in many different settings and places and churches, inevitably, that one line is the line that I hear the most about from people. Me too, people will say to me in the receiving line. Others, it's so hard. I've struggled with an eating disorder since, or my daughter, or someone that I love. And the line I hear the most from people is, how do you do it? Can you actually recover? People ask. So when I thought about, when I thought about us doing this sermon or this service today around food, and it was no different than when I've brought up the topic of food any other time. We are in worship planning. And at one point I had to stop the conversation because every single person there had, we could do this, we could talk about this, we could talk about this. And so finally I said, we'll carry on that conversation again. And yet I knew there was one particular aspect or lens on the topic of food that I couldn't not address this morning. And that is the topic of people who struggle with eating disorders. People like me who struggle with or have struggled with eating disorders know that the topic of food can be very painful. It isn't a joke or funny. It isn't a joke or funny when people who struggle with this say, we can't stop eating cookies once we start. I should just say that my eating disorder started when I was probably about 9, and it was only in the last 6 or 7 years that I could say I have fully recovered. That's a long time. It's a long time. And it has taken various manifestations over those decades. For me, it started with anorexia. So not only is it not funny if people say we can't stop eating cookies once we start, it also isn't just because we're stubborn that we don't eat anything more, or that it creates terror at the thought of putting it into our bodies. The statistics around this are staggering. The National Eating Disorder Association estimates that 10 million Americans struggle with an eating disorder. 10 to 15% of Americans suffer from what they term a serious eating disorder. 77% of people report that these disorders last from 1 to 15 years, and in many cases, much, much longer. And perhaps the thing that causes me the most pain is that eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. As I said, I developed my eating disorder young and struggled with it in a variety of manifestations for decades. I can also say that it saved my life as much as it hurt it. It did things for me that I needed it to do when it first began. And gosh, do I wish this wasn't a message that I needed to share today, right? It's not really one, and yet it is so important that we talk about these things. So important. At my lowest weight, when I was in my teens, I ate exactly, the title of this reflection, 2 pieces of thinly sliced, 44 calories a piece, Pepperidge Farm whole wheat bread with a very thin layer of orange marmalade on them for breakfast, and 2 frozen fish sticks for dinner with nothing else in between. I weighed 69 pounds when I was taken to the hospital. Years later, when my symptoms were manifesting in binging, I would eat until I was sick. And then I would hide in my house, in loose clothes. I remember the time going to a gas station convenience store and someone seeing me and saying they didn't realize I was expecting a child, and I wasn't. So I would do that over and over until it passed, only to do it again a few days later. So Thanksgiving, for all of those years, with its focus on family and food, was not a happy-go-lucky occasion. I didn't believe it was possible to recover. I truly didn't. In fact, I had been put down other addictions for years when one day I said to someone, it's just who I am. This will never change. In fact, it would be as though the sky became the ground and the ground became the sky. And yet, it did change. In its time, with a lot of support, a lot of persistence, a lot of self-love, a lot of deep friends, and care. It's been many years since I've struggled in this way, and I'm eternally grateful. So I don't share this to bring us down or to be dramatic or melancholy. Here's why I share this morning. I share this because right now, right here in this service, people are struggling and they're in pain, either with their own disordered relationships with food or because someone that they love and care about is struggling. As I say, I could not have gone through this service and talked about food in all these various ways and not talked about this. I couldn't have run the risk of people feeling more shame, more alone, or more different. Our church believes in human potential. We recognize that we are all broken. We are all broken. We are all healing, and we are all spectacular. This community is a place of hope, of healing, and of holding while we all find our way home. So for all who struggle, there is a way out, and there is light. May you find that path. Reach out for support and know what a beautiful, beloved child of the universe you are. Amen.